All right, Assalamu alaikum, good evening, peace be upon you. Welcome to the International Institute of Islamic Thought's annual Al-Faruqi Memorial Lecture and Reception. The theme of tonight's lecture is Knowledge and Power, Hegemonic Research Methods, and the Neo-Orientalist Discourse. When I was invited to moderate this lecture a few months ago, I could not have imagined a timelier relevance for this topic than today, as we witness a devastating genocide unfolding in the Gaza Strip that has claimed more than 13,000 lives, including 5,500 children. Many of us are not only grappling with a raw pain and unimaginable heartbreak of witnessing so much death and destruction, but we are also grappling with hegemonic and racist narratives around us that dehumanize brown bodies as responsible for their own demise, narratives that inflict rhetorical violence on colonized and occupied communities by viewing their lives as less worthy of saving than the lives of others. Hegemonic discourses that legitimize both real and rhetorical violence need to be dismantled, not just for those on the receiving end of violence, but for the liberation of those complicit in justifying or inflicting violence. As a Christian theologian, Miguel de la Torre argues, when one is liberated from one's own hatreds and biases, one develops a more valid understanding of God and Scripture. Therefore, a liberation theology, and in this case, a discourse of liberation, is as crucial for those embedded in hierarchical structures of power as it is for those disenfranchised from those very structures of power. And with this, I would like to say a few words about the background of Dr. Ismail al-Faruqi, who is the individual around which this memorial revolves, memorial lecture. He was a co-founder of International Institute of Islamic Thought and the Association of Muslim Social Scientists. He was born in Jaffa, Palestine, and he completed his undergraduate education from the American University of Beirut. He eventually moved to the United States, and he joined Temple University's newly established Department of Religion and founded the Islamic Studies program there. He was, in fact, a mentor of one of my mentors, Dr. John Esposito. He was also the president of the American Islamic College in Chicago, and he initiated the Islam section at the American Academy of Religion. He was an exceptional scholar of Islam and comparative religions who was trained at Indiana University, Harvard University, and McGill University. He was among the pioneers who represented Islam in interreligious dialogue when this movement was just beginning. Indeed, he was a scholar who engaged with not only the history of religion, but also the challenges of religion faced in contemporary times. His wife, Dr. Lamia al-Faruqi, a distinguished scholar of Islamic art, co-authored with him the work titled The Cultural Atlas of Islam. I will also mention that Dr. Lamia al-Faruqi is one of the first scholars that I know of that I found in the late 1970s who was discussing the importance and significance of using an Islamic feminist framework far before historians like Margot Badran said that the word or term was used very frequently. Obviously, many of you are very familiar with the tragic way in which the al-Faruqi family was, their lives were cut short. And may God have mercy on them. I would like to now introduce the distinguished keynote speaker for today, Dr. Deina Abdelkader. She is an international relations expert who focuses on Islamic activism and the politics, religion, and culture of the Middle East and North Africa. Her specialization is comparative democratization in the Muslim world. As an associate professor of political science at UMass Lowell, okay. Dr. Abdelkader teaches classes in Islam and politics on legal thought, Middle East and North African politics, and women in Islam. She currently directs the Peace and Conflict program at her home institution. She is one of the co-founders of Cohort for the Study of Islam and International Relations, an international research cohort established in 2013 in Rapallo, Italy, of which she is a co-director. She is also the co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Islam in Asia, published by Brill, and co-editor-in-chief of a book series with Palgrave Publishing, Islam and Global Studies. Professor Abdelkader has published Islamic Activists, the Anti-Enlightenment Democrats, in 2011, Modernity and the Principle of Public Welfare in 2003, and Social Justice in Islam in 2000. She also co-edited and contributed to Islam and International Relations and Islam in International Affairs, Politics, and Paradigm. Without further ado, Dr. Abdelkader.
Hey, so thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Saulat, for going through many steps to finally succeeding in coming here. Thank you for coming, and I hope I figure some thought processes and questions, lots of questions by my presentation. So basically, there's a distinction between normative and objective knowledge, and how social scientists imagine that the research is solely built on objectivity is currently being challenged, especially in the political science field. If we take culture as an example, and more specifically the question of identity and identity politics in the Muslim world, we will find that the current modus operandi in political science research is distancing itself from objective knowledge because of the increased focus in the field on quantification. Today's talk will analyze the effect of research methodology on power in academic research and the effects of neo-Orientalism on studying and researching the Muslim world. An effort that was initiated by Dr. Ismail Faruqi, followed by Dr. Taha Jaber Al-Alwani and Dr. Mona Abul Fadl. Dr. Al-Faruqi's legacy and activism are part and parcel of what we see today in public opinion and political awareness of the situation in Gaza. He was one who was an activist as well as a scholar, and he initiated this interest in the region and created the knowledge base that we now see with people rallying around the cause of Gaza. Dr. Faruqi's academic suspicion was in place, and research methods are skewed. However, just as much as we need to address essentializing Muslims as terrorists by security studies, one needs to be careful not to essentialize Islamic methods of research because knowledge and its creation are lucid and beneficial in times where political strife and conflict are less. For example, I connect Ibn Khaldun's work to the three Abrahamic followers of his work, St. Thomas Aquinas, Maimonides, and Al-Shatibi. In two of the most information-ridden fields of the social sciences and humanities, namely political science and history, one finds that the majority of the studies are Orientalist or at best Neo-Orientalist. While historian studies explain the quote-unquote liberal age in the Arab world as a mere reaction to colonization and as an attempt to copy and imitate Western civilization, it is no surprise that a political scientist, Samuel Huntington, writes later about a clash of civilizations. In other words, we talk about Western reformers who borrowed Andalusian ideas in the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery in Europe. Is historical discourse then stratified within a certain hierarchy, one which views legitimate scientific research as an enigma to certain cultures, whereby they borrow because they do not follow a similar logic and normal knowledge acquisition? So I will talk about history and then switch to political science. It is no surprise that historical chronicles of the Muslim world that are written by regional historians and social scientists use the same language and epistemological disposition as the Orientalists do. Albert Hourani's Arabic thought in the liberal age is testimony to the assumption that Arabic liberal thought was only reactionary to occupation. The first was the gradual formation, this is a quote from Hourani, the first was the gradual formation of a group of reformers with a certain knowledge of the modern world and the conviction that the empire must belong to it or perish, end of quote. As Hourani continues his analysis of the historical watershed, as he asserts the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt to be, he writes that the reformers, quote, set high value on the social morality of Islam and tried to justify the adoption of Western institutions in Islamic terms as being not the introduction of something new, but a return to the true spirit of Islam, end of quote. The latter quote highlights the deep-rooted biases held by one of the top Middle East historians. According to Hourani's perception, the so-called reformers were trying to introduce new knowledge that Islam and Muslims were not familiar with, and that the only way reformers could justify this was for them to claim that this was the true spirit, quote unquote, of the faith. Therefore, the assertion here is that those new Western reforms were disconnected and strange to the faith and its followers. Hourani here assumes the position of interpreter not only of those efforts' genuine assertion that they are trying to revive the faith's original spirit, but also he asserts that the reformers were aware that they are trying to sugarcoat concepts that do not prevail in Muslim society. Hourani's well-regarded book, Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age, is in totality a good example of the allocation of modernity and civilization as a synonym of Western Europe, and that reformers in the Muslim world were only imitators and reactionary in their efforts. Thus, their discourse lacked any normal pretext of social scientific advancement that all peoples practice throughout history. Hourani here embraces and fortifies the superiority of the colonizer and Orientalist discourse by asserting intentionally or casually that the only way to westernize, modernize Muslims was by sugarcoating pure and homogeneous Western concepts in similarly unilateral Islamic terms. Hourani was not the first or last historian to write from such a perspective. The subaltern discourse has for centuries academically written and discussed the muhaddithin, reformers, as authors who attempted to imitate Western ways after the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt and the beginning of the Ottomans' fall from Greece as an empire. The importance of Hourani is that in many ways, Hourani has affected and still affects contemporary Middle Eastern historical discourse. The importance of Hourani also lies in the fact that he was one of the first historians to discuss the chronicling of ideas and Arab thought in general. It is important to note that before and after Hourani's contribution, that subaltern literature analyzed modernization and reform from the same perspective as Hourani. As opposed to Hourani, today's talk argues that civilizations and peoples borrow from each other and that humanity throughout history has lived through fluid borders, especially when it comes to the exchange of ideas and principles. So now I switch gears to the other field that I promised I'd talk about, political science. Since approximately 2010, there has been a dramatic rise in quantified statistical research, which affected many subfields, as I will discuss, but more importantly to my talk today, this change is a danger to the study of Muslim majority societies. For example, Gardner it emphasizes the limitations of political science. He says, quote, "It does not necessarily follow, however, that the political scientist's results demonstrate anything significant about the norm under study. All political science shows in this situation, all it can ever show, is achievement or non-achievement of the proxy measure that the political scientist has chosen to stand in for the norm's own validating conditions. Those are the sacrifices of political relevance on the altar of methodology." End of quote. The overflow from the Americanist research methods into international relations is causing a seismic shift. If one could run a statistical test that links elections in Guatemala to elections in the United States, one becomes an instant expert on Guatemalan affairs or Latin American affairs. Knowledge and training in the international relations comparative politics field is not needed. Therefore, there is no need for regionalists or specialists in political science anymore, because the modus operandi is to create what is called thin theory. Comparative democratization as a subfield in political science has found it difficult to progress given the increased focus on what Coppedge calls thin theory versus thick theory. And I quote him, "Thick approaches lend themselves to rich understanding of specific events. Thin approaches lend themselves to hypotheses testing and generalizations." As a specialist in the political science subfield of security studies, Van Evra also defines, quote, methodologism, which means an overdone focus on methodological techniques, especially techniques for measuring causal relationships. This focus has come at the expense of concern for other elements of successful social science. A cult of irrelevance. It fosters empirical sterility and theoretical stagnation. Another important factor that directly relates to research on Muslim majority societies is that there is a polarization in research methods between Americanists or scholars of American politics and international relations and comparative politics scholars. A 2009 survey found that 68% of international relations scholars in the United States use mainly qualitative methods in their work, while 23% use mainly quantitative methods, and 2% use mainly formal modeling. Only 4% of the articles in international security from the 1990s use statistical methods. So this gives you an idea that this jump was sudden. So what is the effect on Muslim majority societies? I'm going to talk about different projects. The first one is the Arab Barometer. One of the data sets that exemplify thin theory is the Arab Barometer data. The paper written by Messenger, Jamal, and Mazur, titled "Who Participated in the Arab Spring? A Comparison of Egyptian and Tunisian Revolutions," explains how they measured piety in Tunisia and Egypt. Quote, "To capture levels of piety, we constructed a 15-point scale measuring the frequency with which individuals perform 5 behaviors associated with religiosity, including reading the Quran or Bible and praying. The questioning of the people's practice of the faith is so culturally and politically loaded in that part of the world that responses to those questions risk evaluatory inaccuracies. Whether we consider colonization or the forced nature of secularization post-colonization, people from all socioeconomic levels of society are extremely aware of the sensitivity of such questions. This weariness is derived from the colonial and post-colonial experience that entails apologetic behavior on the part of the indigenous Muslim population. Without getting into further historical detail, which is exactly what Coppage thinks of is of prime significance and importance, it is obvious that the questions in the survey were inadequate culturally and historically. The research contradicts itself by stating that, quote, though we have no direct evidence on the religious character of civil society associations, it is reasonable to infer that many were religious in orientation. Islamic charitable societies and religious movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Al-Nahda in Tunisia, exemplify this tendency, end of quote. That is to say, they realized that gathering information about religious practices did not provide them with direct evidence on the religious character of civil society. The cited paper also indicates that according to their survey, participants in the revolution in Egypt demonstrated, quote, primarily about the economy, with demands for civil and political freedoms ranking relatively low, end of quote. How does this data and research reconcile the fact that Wa'il Ghunaim was deemed as the symbol of the revolution because of his Facebook page, We Are All Khalid Saeed, a young student who was brutally attacked in public by the police till he died? Then the government forced forensics to say that he died because of a drug overdose a year before the revolution. Again, another example of the study contradicting itself in terms of findings, the co-authored paper starts first by stating that participants in the Egyptian revolution were disproportionately middle-aged, middle-class, professional, and religious. Later on, they state, quote, similarly, religiosity does not appear to be systemically related to protest participation. So this is my first example of how quantification could lead us astray. My second example is Mark Lynch, and this is he's the one who actually coined the Arab Spring, and this is sort of another example, but it's not a negative one, it is a positive one, because he's quite aware, and the authors that worked with him on his edited volume are quite aware of the need to be more specific, the need to have thick concepts and thick theory. So Mark Lynch's Arab Uprisings Explained, it's an edited volume. He introduces the book by emphasizing the difficulty of predicting the Arab Spring. And he says, quote, scholars of the Arab world are suffering their own paradigm crisis, surprised by mass political rebellions that few saw coming beyond asking hard questions about the theories that had informed our work. We are once again trying to decide just how our geographic area fits into the wider field of comparative politics itself. So we're in agreement. There is a struggle between working with the specificity of identity, culture, religion, and being able to generalize about the Muslim world as a whole. Upon applying current methodology to the Arab Spring, the authors of the edited volume emphasize the danger of shoehorning regions to fit in the larger schema of generalizable theory. As previously discussed in Gardner's critique, researchers are sacrificing political relevance at the altar of methodology. The current ability to monopolize journal publications, conferences, and the growth of the field itself will eventually lead to the demise and neglect of regionalism, let alone a country-specific analysis. Methodological rigidity and the focus on grand theory building will have very limited insights or the ability to predict political phenomena. This forecast will bring forth stillborn regional studies, which will ultimately affect those studies at large, let alone the study of religion and historical context. Now I will switch to the third article, which is an APSR, the American Political Science Review article, one of the best journals in their field. This is a starker example, published in 2018, one of, like I said, the leading journals. And the article is titled Social and Institutional Origins of Political Islam. The article's main hypothesis is that political Islam was not founded or stimulated by Western missionary activity. We can detect, this is a quote from the authors, we can detect no statistically significant effect of Christian missionary activity in patterning branch formation, and the presence of large European populations in a district significantly reduced the likelihood that a branch would be established, challenging the arguments that attribute the growth of political Islam to contact between Muslims and the West. End of quote. The authors do not give any context or historical background to those assumptions. First and foremost, the Muslim Brothers, and before them, Al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, and Rashid Rida, all write that part of their mission is to defeat the cultural encroachment of British occupation and more specifically Christian missionary activity. Second, in the article, it is insignificant that the Muslim Brothers were targeting areas, segments of the population that are different from the missionaries, because the main hypothesis of the article is that contact between the West and Muslims did not lead to the growth of political Islam, which is obviously the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood. The authors go on to prove that the Muslim Brotherhood did not establish offices in areas that were inhabited by Europeans as support to their argument that political Islam was not a reaction to Western presence. First, only a minority of Egyptians could afford to live in areas that were popular amongst the Western expats. Second, again, this argument is fatuous because the Muslim Brothers do not have to create headquarters where Europeans physically reside to prove their opposition to missionary activity or occupation. Third, and most important, the article exemplifies the power constructs that I referred to previously, because the authors impose their discourse, their data, with no regard to the subject's agency or the argument that they're making. Al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Qutb have constantly mentioned and written that their collaboration targets missionaries and their supporters. This juncture is exactly where the danger of neo-Orientalism lies, where assumptions are made, data created, results drawn in a supposedly sterile scientific manner, normatively, seemingly objective. However, those studies are totally disconnected from the reality of the subject's voice. The Muslim Brotherhood utilized the new railways, again, this is one of the assumptions. The Muslim Brotherhood utilized the new railways in creating and maintaining their branches. Quote, a close examination of those sources suggests that the Muslim Brotherhood deliberately exploited the railway to reach new constituencies and consolidate newly formed branches. This argument, to a lesser extent than the first hypothesis mentioned above, is largely insignificant because one could assume that any social movement would utilize the best communication methods available to create and maintain its branches. Are those hypotheses relevant to the Muslim Brotherhood only? Are the authors suggesting that if railways were not there, that the Muslim Brotherhood would have been less successful in creating branches and gaining members? Even if this was true, what is the relevance in the larger context of the Brotherhood's creation and its success as a social movement? From a comparativist perspective, the statistics gathered in the study at best prove correlation and not causation, especially with regards to means of transportation. The authors state, quote, by bridging geographic and social space in this way, Egypt's railroad system facilitated and empowered the rise of organized political Islam, end of quote. This conclusion is tautological because the existence of Egypt's railroad system could have activated other political organizations and groups as well. The argument here is that both in the Arab barometer and the social and the institutional origins of political Islam is that they both hearken us to a neo-Orientalist discourse where the research subject is objectified, the researcher controls the measurement and expression of the findings, the research subject is exoticized and framed as an actor lacking in expediency. So, there are other critics of those methods, and I will point now to Keshkin and Shakir's work. Keshkin critiques those studies as neo-Orientalists and writes that they are not different from their predecessors, the Orientalists, and that the sociology as well as international global studies fields have been dominated by grant and career-making forms of scholarship that have only slight differences from the interests of states and state-funded organizations. Keshkin's description of neo-Orientalism in the United States foreign policy of liberal humanitarian imperialism or white liberalism that is supported by academics and intellectuals and theory research agendas. In Shakir's analysis of RAND and the RAND reports after 9/11, she emphasizes the imbricated nature of academic and policy communities as two intrinsically enmeshed epistemic networks, end of quote. In a similar vein, today's moderation theory continues to evaluate political change like its 19th century forebears, by its proximity to the institutions and values of Western and particularly Anglo-American societies. Not only categories modeled after European experience are projected upon Islamist communities to order their political present, but through its inherent directionality, the term moderation also provides a glimpse of the future of these societies as well, a glimpse that is comforting to the West. Shakir says that is, it reproduces the global hegemony of a specific grammar of politics without fully engaging with the alternative life world of the Islamist actors under analysis. End of quote. Thus, in agreement with my earlier analysis of the APSR article, Shakir highlights the irrelevance of the actors studied or their agency. That is to say, the Islamist and Muslim majority societies in general. Most of the literature, especially post 9/11, denies the possibility of engaging in a dissenting discourse because of the academic backlash. This academic backlash came in many forms. One, the concerted effort to marginalize area study. Two, the return to metrics as in the pre-colonial era of describing the Muslim other through assumedly objective measures, thus reducing the subject and topic of research to inanimate, static, exotic, and more importantly, an entity that has no interest. In Shakir's efforts to clarify the problems that arise with classifying a specific group of Islamists as moderns, she rightfully stresses that this is escape. Quote, absolves comparative researchers from the more pressing methodological challenges that accompany attempts to understand, interpret, and translate the political agency of Islamist groups in their own terms and from within the discursive framework that shapes their perspectives. End of quote. In agreement with Shakir's argument, social scientific categories may not be by themselves and directly involved with the subjection and power inequalities between the societies that produce the observer and the observed respectively. But taken together, they cannot be easily separated from contemporary projections of imperial power. The problem is such categories of analysis and how one measures variables. Collectively, such discourses consolidate an understanding of what it means to be democratic, and act democratically, that are expressed through Western theoretical debates and categories of analysis, insofar as our political commitment to democracy in the Muslim world remain tied to Western theoretical frameworks, our accounts remain implicated in the imperialism of categories. Again, Shakir, I'll go back to her, emphasizes that the instruments and methods used in measuring democracy in the Middle East and the Muslim world suffered direly from the lack of input of the indigenous voice of culture, history, and agency of the subject under study. An Islamic view of social justice and its intrinsic connection to ideal governance, for example. The research examples that I offered and referred to harken me back to Sir Richard Burton's writing in 1855. Describing Eastern women, he says, they were average specimens of the steady Hyagus Abyssinian breed, broad-shouldered, thin-flanked, fine-limbed, and with haunches of a prodigious size. None of them had handsome features, but the short curly hair that stands on end, being concealed under a kerchief. There was something pretty in the brow, eyes, and upper part of the nose, coarse and sensual, independent lips, large jowl, and projecting mouth, whilst the whole had a combination of piquancy with sweetness. Their style of flirtation was peculiar, end of quote. As if Burton's usage of the racial lineage and his usage of scientific terms of description concealed his discriminatory and racist depiction of those women. Neo-Orientalists utilize scientific methods, statistical data, not only to ostracize regionalists, but also to negate the other's agency and logic. Thus, Dr. Faruqi and later on Dr. Taha Jabal Al-Alwani and Dr. Mona Abul-Fadl, all of their concerns and doubts materialized, wherein, as I have illustrated, that the adoption of generalizable research methods is in direct contradiction to research that relies on religious specificity and theoretical knowledge. The danger here is that this neo-Orientalist scheme powerfully dictates agendas of research, funding, and publication at the very moment where Muslim societies are struggling to found authentic governance, explain reactionary social movements, and gain expediency in the international relations and comparative politics fields. So, this was the problem. Where do we go from here? Although Foucault might not be exemplary in his representations to the Muslim world, I find his work on knowledge and power informative to my arguments about Neo-Orientalism in the field of history and political science. Foucault, along with Wa'il Hallaq, also lay a plan of how researchers could realize change in the dynamics of power and knowledge. I will start with the clarification of the Foucauldian terms. Docile and discursive, dissenting and subversive were created by Hallaq. The docile author is an author who contributes to their area of study without any criticism of its theoretical assumptions or broad schema of explanations. The docile author does not question the epistemic roots of their discipline and contributes to building up the theory without challenging its assumptions. Meanwhile, the discursive author is highly aware of the shortcomings of their field and therefore challenges the epistemic foundations in search of new or newer foundations in juxtaposing their theoretical question and research. Thus, the docile author confines himself or herself to the limits and boundaries of the existing discourse, whereby he or she do not analyze the epistemic roots of the research. Even when they engage in critique, it is directed at details and specificities, at minor or even major revisions required in an otherwise accepted narrative, but never at the gestalt in which the knowledge is produced and confined. He or she continue to contribute to the body of knowledge, however, they form something of a cog in a machine. Such an author is docile because his docility is guaranteed by the mechanisms of power that both constrain and control his thinking, and to which he is subordinated consciously or unconsciously. Therefore, the discursive author is the direct opposite of, on the spectrum of challenging the status quo discourse, and Foucault gives examples of that disposition, like Karl Marx and Freud as the discursive authors in his book, What is an Author? So as opposed to Foucault's distinction between docile and discursive, as mentioned, Hallaq creates two new categories that mitigate Foucault's, and these are the dissenting author and the subversive author. So Hallaq says, a dissenting author refuses the assumptions, the findings, and the received wisdom that characterize the docile author. The latter may engage in a critique of other docile authors, usually over details or relative details, but the critique never transgresses the boundaries of the commonly accepted assumptions of the discursive tradition or formation in which he or she operates. The episteme, as Foucault would say, is never the issue. End of quote. The dissenting author is important in Hallaq's writing and signifies to him Edward Said's analysis and contribution in Orientalism. Said's work is considered, according to Hallaq, as, quote, a correction within the system, but the system nonetheless, which remains in its foundational principles and structural modes of existence and operation, more or less the same, end of quote. On the other hand, the subversive author interrogates the foundational assumptions and epistemological mainstays of the discursive formations, as well as of the larger system of power that sustains them. The subversive author, according to Hallaq's schema, combines attributes of both the dissenting and the discursive. Hallaq criticizes Said's Orientalism because Said was not critical of the foundational aspects of Orientalism, as a subversive or even discursive author would do. I think, on my own accounts, that Said was subversive, actually. Look at all the fields that use his work today, whether we talk about international relations, gender studies, there are many fields that utilize Orientalism. If we focus our aim to be subversive in the study of all things that pertain to Islam and Muslims, I think we would be true to Al-Faruqi's original goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Abdelkader. That was a wonderful, very eye-opening lecture, insightful lecture. So we'd invite you to please come forward, and we invite you to ask questions, make comments, brief comments if you have them, and engage with the professor. Yes. Oh, please. There's a yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I just have a practical question for those of us who are teaching and using surveys, data. I mean, you talked about how, you know, the research strips away the agency and objectifies the subject. But for me, who's, you know, someone who sometimes uses surveys as portions, like, what do you suggest? Like, because sometimes you want to back up things, and most of the stuff that comes out from field is done by non-Muslims, it's very, sometimes the questions are difficult even, like to the audience, to the Muslim audience posed, and how do we, who are in the classroom, navigate that? How do we use surveys with, that in mind? Like, how do we, like, I feel like, okay, no, I see that, and I always have this going off caution. But are there any suggestions for those of us who use survey data and how to, make them, keep those things in mind that you just mentioned?
I think so.
Thank you for your question. I think a reasonable way of doing things is focus on the data that is not wouldn't be heavily weighted with sort of a cultural question or a religious question, and always augment with a lot of context, whether it's historical, depending on what is at study. But basically augment the knowledge. Where is this coming from? Historically, culturally, religiously. So there has to be a meeting of sorts of this data is saying this, and it might be true, it might be accurate, right? Especially if it's pointing out at something very generic and very generalized, because there is such data. However, when it comes to the complexities of, are you faithful? Did your faith have anything to do with going out and revolting? This is when, you have to augment the data.
Other questions?
Thank you for the lecture. I actually had a question. I don't know if the question was supplementing, let's say. At the very beginning, we're talking about the agency of the native informant and the voice of the Muslim woman, and was speaking about the Muslim woman issue, Muslim voice, what have you. And here I'm wondering what your position is on, to what extent do I also need to question the orientalized or the colonized or the not decolonized viewpoint of that so-called native informant? So when I do speak to a native informant, when I do give them the voice, not if an author is giving voice or taking voice, to what extent do they need to account for? And as a reader, to what extent do we need to question the validity of that opinion or of that voice that's being voiced?
I'm not quite sure about the question, so let me get a clarification. You're saying that the native voices are they're value ridden also, and they're basically a result of colonization.
It could be. So to what extent should I give the author, and to what extent should I give the author the right to, and the reader the responsibility to unpack the opinion that comes from so-called native informant? Should I just assume that a native informant is a native informant that has that weight, or am I entitled to and responsible to unpack that and contextualize it in relation to where does that opinion come from? How much of it is it theirs, and how much of it is colonial heritage and colonial knowledge, the heritage of colonial knowledge production from?
This is this is sort of a tricky question, because it delves into this is the whole work of anthropology and the observer and the observed, and you have to walk a fine line. There's reason for scientific contextualization that doesn't really step over the agency of the native, and that's it's a research specific and question specific issue. So I hope I answered that.
Can I follow on that?
Yeah.
Actually, since you mentioned that it's context, let me give a context and see your opinion on a particular. If you allow me.
Sure.
I mean, just to test how we do it. So, for example, if I'm dealing with, let's say, religious minorities, and so I want to speak about religious minorities in a particular context. Do I go to speak to Egyptian Christians or Shia in Lebanon or Shia or Kurds in Iraq, for example? Minoritarian questions. Seeing that we've spoken about statistics, political science, and that I think is very kind of central focus. So the production of the minoritarian identity has also been largely the product of colonial processes. So when I speak to a minoritarian individual or community leader or so on, should I take their what they tell me? To what extent should I assume that what they tell me is the opinion of, them, their context, and to what extent should I assume that it could be also the legacy of divide and conquer and so on and so forth?
Okay, so the researcher here really has and I've seen and still continues, unfortunately, especially in the Middle East region, that somebody from a certain minority chooses to focus on this minority and highlights the misery that they're living in. It's not to say that they don't live in misery, right? In different countries, and it doesn't say that obviously colonization had nothing to do with it. So the researcher here, if they're fair, which sometimes they're not, most of the time they're not, they contextualize things. They say, women are not only, they're not the only subject of oppression in country A, the men are also oppressed, or I could think of many examples of that. The Kurds in Iraq, they weren't, they didn't have schools, they didn't have running water, but so did many other areas in Iraq, right? So context is important, and a researcher who is careful with what they're doing and honest with what they're doing will do that. But unfortunately, you see sometimes that people utilize that to agitate and continue the conditions of those minorities in that part of the world.
I have one question for you. I mean, I think it's tempting, if I could use this as tempting, the idea of a subversive writer. But at the same time, I mean, for many of us who are junior academics, junior writers, there's also this idea that you also need to engage with the status quo, if you will, in order to first establish your credentials. So I'm curious how that would play out.
They're not only young, believe me, also seniors are suffering. It is a challenge. It is really a challenge because, as we have seen with Edward Said and the opposition that he created and is still alive and well. Daniel Pipes has wonderful theories about Gaza that he's publishing now. It is difficult because we don't own, in Marxist terms, the means of production. We don't own spreading scientific journals or getting grants, which is really important for, like you said, junior or senior faculty. So it is very challenging to become a subversive author. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, so with that, we will conclude and wrap up. Thank you so much for coming, and please join me in thanking Dr. Deina.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for IIIT, and I really hope I presented something of Dr. Ismail Faruqi's and Dr. Taha Jabal Alwani's thoughts. Thank you.